Hi class, back again to finish up chapter 11. Today we're going to explain the startle and enhanced startle and talk a little bit about fear in the amygdala and anti-anxiety drugs and how they work. Well, fear and anxiety is more complicated than one would think, as is everything in the brain, right? We have what's called a startle reflex, and that's our first place, a starting point for fear, is that if somebody goes out and go boo, then all of a sudden you startle, right? That's the startle reflex. It's just a reaction to a loud noise. And it happens because the cochlear nucleus, which is actually in our responding to our ears, is in the medulla, in the brainstem there. And that's going to influence the pons, which is going to tense up the neck muscles, because the idea is that there's something that could damage you, you got to tense up. Okay, so the response tends to be enhanced if the person is already tense. So if something happens and you're already freaked out, you react even stronger. So we call that the enhanced startle. Okay, well, we've studied this a lot in animals, the enhanced startle and how it works and how the amygdala is involved. So let's talk about how we study it. Initially in training, what they're going to do is, well, essentially you're going to augment the startle response. And how you do that is if you shock an animal, you get a startle response, right? But then if you put a light and pair it with the shock, so you have a light and the shock at the same time, then you will eventually train the animal that the light will make him sort of nervous, you know, so that when the light goes on, then he gets shocked, then the response is even stronger because he understands that the light is associated with a shock. So the light makes him nervous, basically. And you can do this also with a noise. And so you can test him with the shock alone, and then you can also test him with the light that has been paired with the shock, the noise that has been paired with the shock, and see how it differs from either of these things by themselves. So why do they do this? I mean, they do this because it models our ability to detect threats in our environment. So let's say you meet somebody and you just think this person is like a little bit shady. So you're kind of on alert. So when something happens, you really freak out. And so that's kind of good for us to have that enhanced startle. It keeps us on alert. So what does fear look like in the brain? Well, the amygdala has connections to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamic connections are going to give us the response. Remember, hypothalamus, two things are fight and flight. It's going to give us that autonomic response, blood pressure going up, breathing going up, and all that kind of stuff. The amygdala also has connections to the prefrontal cortex, which gives us that kind of interpretation of fear, something to be scared of, something scary here. It also has connections to the midbrain and the pons, and that is going to activate that startle response. What you see with rats with amygdala damage is they will show that basic startle response, starting with the cochlear nucleus. But what they will not show is the enhanced startle. So the amygdala is really about learning what to fear, learning to fear the light, or learning to fear the noise that goes along with the shock, as opposed to startling to the shock alone. Well, if we look at the human amygdala, what we see is that the amygdala is more active when viewing fearful and angry expressions, just pictures, than reviewing happy expressions. So this picture here would activate your amygdala more than a picture of a person smiling. But what's interesting about the amygdala, again, because it's sort of kind of trying to figure out what to fear in the environment, the amygdala is good at that. The response of the amygdala is strongest when the expression is a little bit ambiguous, or where like if you can't really tell, it looks a little bit angry or a little bit fearful, that's when the amygdala really reacts. The amygdala also reacts to subliminal emotional expressions. So sometimes they'll show some pictures and then real fast they'll show a picture of something very scary. The amygdala will respond even though the person says that they never saw that. And so it may be that that's what gives us this sort of gut feeling. We've actually seen something our amygdala responds to, but we didn't actually consciously see it. So it may be that the amygdala is actually making sense of emotional messages in the sense that it's kind of a warning system. It kind of keeps us alert about what is potentially dangerous. Okay, let's talk a little bit about anti-anxiety drugs. In the amygdala, we see that GABA is a main inhibitory neurotransmitter. So that's going to turn down the amygdala. CCK, which we talked about as a hormone in the hunger section, is cholecystokinin, and it also serves as a neurotransmitter. And orexin, which we talked about in sleep, with particularly with narcolepsy, are excitatory neurotransmitters there. So increasing cholecystokinin or orexin is going to increase anxiety. Increasing GABA is going to decrease anxiety. So there's a very popular set of drugs called the benzodiazepines, and these involve, these are things like Valium and, what is the name of that drug? I can't remember, but anyway, it'll come to me. Librium, what else? It's one that's really popular. Anyway, not going to spend time on it. The benzodiazepines are GABA agonists, and those are drugs that are going to increase GABA, therefore bringing down the anxiety. There's a risk of addiction in all of these. We see a rebound anxiety that happens once you stop taking the drug. So a lot of people got addicted to Valium. That's a really, that what used to be a very common addiction. Now the addiction is to this other one. I can't remember the name of. Anyway, sleepiness, memory problems and stuff like that are also resulting from these drugs. So you shouldn't be driving and stuff like that being on these drugs. Okay, serotonin agonists have also been successfully used for anxiety. For example, Zoloft, Buspar, Prozac, drugs like that have also been really good for anxiety. Behavioral therapy for fear. Exposure therapy is the #1 behavioral therapy we see for fear. And what that is exposure in a safe environment. And unfortunately what happens is it tends to create a spontaneous recovery that brings back the fear later. So we can get rid of fear by exposing someone to the object of the fear. For example, if you're exposed to elevators all the time, you're unlikely to become fearful of elevators or to continue to be fearful of elevators. But suddenly, all of a sudden, you become fearful of elevators again in this spontaneous recovery. But one of the things we've found that we can do is use a drug called propranolol, and that's a drug that suppresses the autonomic response system, so we don't get the heart rate increase and stuff like that. It's called a beta blocker, and people use it for hypertension. And if you give this drug immediately after a memory recall, a traumatic memory recall, it can decrease the subsequent emotional intensity of that fearful memory. So that does control spontaneous recovery. So between exposure therapy and some of the drug therapy, we can do a good job with controlling. Okay, I had to pause because I thought I was going crazy trying to remember the name of the drug. The drug that I'm talking about, the benzodiazepine that's very popular right now, is Xanax. And so again, you've probably known people who have taken Xanax, and those can create a lot of problems with addiction and things like that. So, okay, I want to identify the connections between stress and the immune system and talk a little bit about what happens there. Okay, there's an area, when we have a stress reaction, we often say that the HPA axis has been activated, and that is the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal cortex. And these are endocrine glands, the pituitary and adrenal cortex, that are going to be involved in hormones that are enhancing this sort of stress feeling or stress response. So the hypothalamus will release a hormone itself, and that's called CRH, and it activates the pituitary, which releases a hormone called ACTH, And then the adrenal cortex will release a hormone called cortisol. Now, why is cortisol important when you're under stress? Cortisol will elevate your blood sugar, which is good. If you got to do fight or flight, you need that glucose in the blood to be able to feed your cells. It will also tend to elevate your metabolism because it's using a lot of glucose. It's going to suppress LH. And remember, LH is luteinizing hormone that's involved in the reproductive response. It's harder to get pregnant, for example, when you're under a lot of stress because you'll tend to have low LH. If prolonged, and this is mainly what I'm going to talk about in this section, what will happen is that cortisol will tend to suppress your immune system. And now with little doses of stress, this doesn't happen, but with chronic stress, it does happen. So it's really something to think about if you're in a situation of chronic stress, meaning stress that goes on for a very long time. So here we see the hypothalamus being active. It's got a releasing factor, which I named earlier, that's CRF, corticotropin releasing factor. And then that will cause the pituitary, anterior pituitary to release ACTH, and that will cause the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. And remember, the cortisol is going to elevate the metabolism. It's going to suppress the reproductive system, and it's also going to suppress the immune system if it goes on for long enough. So cortisol is a little bit dangerous. Okay, well, let's talk about the immune system. The leukocytes are also known as the white blood cells. Are going to consist of the B and T cells and natural killer cells. And what they do is they respond to unfamiliar antigens. An antigen is something on the surface, a protein on the surface of a cell that says, this is not me, there's something wrong here, it's not part of me, so it needs to be attacked by the immune system. And so the B cells will make antibodies. The B cells are nice because they have a sort of memory. They make antibodies that will attack that type of antigen when you see it in the future. So for example, with COVID-19, we're looking for a vaccination, right? That will give us the ability to make those antibodies so that if I come into contact with COVID, my own body will attack it before I get sick. More leukocytes are also T cells and natural killer cells. The T cells can directly attack the antigen, or they can stimulate the production of other B cells and T cells also. T cells are the main point of attack of the HIV virus. They attack the immune system by attacking T cells. And then there's also natural killer cells, and natural killer cells will attack all kinds of intruder cells like tumors and stuff like that. So let's see, we've got this immune system response to all this stuff in the environment that gets in. What's going to happen is that cortisol is going to suppress this immune response, and that's what I want to talk about. So stress, cortisol, and immunosuppression. Long-term stress will produce cortisol again through that HPA axis, and then that will reduce the levels of both B, T, and natural killer cells. And also what we see with prolonged cortisol, high cortisol, is that it increases metabolic activity in the hippocampus. And what it does is if you get enough activity there over a prolonged period of time, it overstimulates the neurons and they end up dying. So it may be that that is happening to us even when we're young, but as we go about aging and more cells are dying, and then the stress compounding, it may in fact lead to memory loss as we get older, and that people that experience more stress when they're younger are more likely to lose that memory as they get older. Not everyone is equally susceptible to PTSD. But PTSD is a very, very common disorder. And what we see in PTSD victims is that they tend to have small hippocampus and they tend to have low cortisol. Now you'd think somebody who was really stressed out with PTSD would have high cortisol, but we've got a kind of a paradoxical relationship with cortisol there. It may be that there was high cortisol at one time that damaged the hippocampus, or it may be that, in fact, they started out with a smaller hippocampus. So some people seem to be more susceptible to PTSD than others. But certainly PTSD is a long-term psychological disorder that is associated with a very stressful circumstance. Okay, that's all I've got for chapter 11, and I hope you enjoyed the videos, and I will hopefully see you in class soon.